growing up in the 90s and being a Sega kid, a loyalist to the Sega Corporation, my jam was the Sonic the Hedgehog series, which, you know what, it is true what they say. Like, there's something about Sonic that resonates with, let's just say, the Spurg Lord, like the kid who is just very into what he's into. And I was one of those kids, die-hard Sega fan, and, I tried to stay faithful to Sega during their turbulent years of brand and financial turmoil. Obviously the Mega Drive was a huge hit in the 90s, and it really did offer a viable alternative to Nintendo. And the OG Sonic the Hedgehog series was a big part of this. It was super popular with my generation of millennial kids. And all was fine and dandy during the Mega Drive / Genesis, as it was known in North America. That particular console era was very fruitful for Sega, and many classic games were released for the Mega Drive. And the real problem that Sega had was trying to follow up this console, because in retrospect, they made some serious errors, I'd say, in developing their successor consoles. It seemed like they kept trying different approaches, different strategies, and attempts to innovate, because I feel like that was Sega's motivation. They wanted to one-up Nintendo and definitively prove they were the better company. And it's kind of like the hubris of Sega. They could have played it safer and perhaps have enjoyed a little more success during this post-Mega Drive period, but alas, this was the beginning of the decline of Sega in earnest. The first attempt at a follow-up to the Mega Drive was, of course, the Mega CD, which is quite a bizarre console and an example of an early attempt at utilizing the CD-ROM technology, which was, of course, becoming the new standard format for storage and, obviously, audio. I really did not want to miss out on Sonic CD, which, when you look back on it now, very weird game. It was developed originally as Sonic the Hedgehog 2. However, because Sega had they outsourced a large part of their business to the US, it turned out that Sonic 2 was developed by their US division, known as Sega of America, who actually had a surprising amount of influence on the Sonic IP, especially this Mega Drive sequel, and was kind of an evolution of the Sonic 1 code, but they changed a lot of things. Obviously, they added Tails, and they added co-op, so it was a different beast entirely. The sprites were a little different. Gameplay was just slightly different, and the atmosphere definitely felt more Western. You can really hear that in the music. And I don't know, 2 for me was never my favorite. I'd say Sonic 3 and Knuckles was my all-time favorite. But CD is a very odd beast, because it was developed by the original Japanese team behind 1. And when you look at it okay, so this was supposed to be the original Sonic 2, it makes a lot more sense, because it actually lacks features that Sonic 2 had. For instance, there is no Tails, there is no Spin Dash. The sprite for Sonic in CD looks almost identical to his Sonic 1 sprite, so it really does feel like the successor to the original, but it also tries to experiment with a lot of new approaches to gameplay. One of them being that the levels are far more vertical, and it does feel like a completely different approach to the gameplay, the core gameplay of Sonic. Because I feel like the American division, they realized that the speed was the fundamental draw of Sonic, right? The gameplay was all about the momentum, the speed, the physics. Whereas Sonic CD, it really does focus more on this exploration kind of approach. You are given far more freedom to experiment with which tier of the level you're kind of traversing. There's a time travel element to the gameplay where you can change what the stage looks like depending on which time period you're in. And that ties in with how to get the best ending. So it is far more intricate in terms of gameplay than Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which feels like more of a straight-up progression from 1, with a bigger emphasis on colors and speed, right? Sonic 2 plays it safe. Sonic CD is like some kind of acid trip. It's like a DMT trip through this hyper-colorful 90s world of just Sonic. It is fantastic, and the game actually received 2 distinct soundtracks, because the Japanese soundtrack of CD was so weird and Japanese and amazing that the US division, they thought, you know what, we might alienate some players with how fucking weird the soundtrack is, so we'll make a separate one. So There's actually 2 soundtracks to the game. Both of them are good. I think that's the thing. I mean, the US soundtrack is definitely less experimental, but both have a really sweet 90s edge, which just hits the spot. But for me personally, I do prefer the Japanese soundtrack because it really does take advantage of the technology. Obviously, there's no more need for MIDI when you have a Sega CD disk drive, although I think a lot of the time it blended MIDI with actual samples. So what you got was this incredibly rich, textured soundtrack with real instruments, real vocal samples, and it is just balls to the wall, like weird, but it's great. And I consider myself lucky to have been able to play Sonic CD at release, on an original Sega CD. Cool console, just not enough games. I mean, that's the problem. It's that Sega released the console, it didn't sell particularly well, and they had to discontinue it so they could keep up with Nintendo. And they never managed to get this balance right, because their next attempt at a console was another add-on. Obviously, the Sega CD is an add-on. I think I forgot to mention that, but you have to have a regular Mega Drive to get the CD to work. They connect together. And Sega continued with this very strange approach to upgrading consoles with the Sega 32X, which was this weird-looking mushroom-shaped peripheral that you connect to the top of the Mega Drive. And you can actually have a Sega CD connected at the same time. So there were actually even a few titles that required both the 32X and the Sega CD to function properly, right? So this was a completely bizarre kind of precursor to the multiple versions of consoles that we have now. Obviously, the Xbox Series X, the Series S, the PS4 Pro, all this baloney that we have now. Sega pioneered this, but in the most autistic way possible, and it didn't work out for them. So the 32X was an even bigger failure than the Sega CD. And to this day, I mean, there are only a handful of games that you can even get for this weird monstrosity, but one of them that I was really interested in was Knuckles, the character Knuckles from Sonic & Knuckles. He had his own game, his debut solo game, which was called Chaotix, or Knuckles Chaotix, right? Which was another very strange experimental title from Sonic Team. And this one was so bizarre when it came to gameplay, it alienated even hardcore Sonic fans. It had this very counterintuitive physics system where you're connected to another character while you play, and you can kind of switch between them and generate momentum based on the tension between 2 rings that each character's holding, and you can generate this tension and then launch yourself. And I wish I could say that I was there at release to experience the weirdness of the Knuckles Chaotix phenomenon, because living in the UK, I mean, I had a very small window of time to acquire one before it was discontinued, and I remember going to the store and being like, so, here I am. I have my pocket money saved, and I'd like to purchase a 32X, please. The guy's just like, yeah, sorry, no, but you might want to wait for the PlayStation, which is coming out soon. I was like, fuck no. No way, I'm a Sonic loyalist, obviously, and even the idea of purchasing a Sony PlayStation, it disgusted me to even think about it, right? So I decided to acquire a Sega Saturn next, which I think it had been out for a while, but unfortunately, the Saturn was another one of Sega's mistakes, really. I mean, not the kind of abomination the 32X was, but in classic Sega fashion, it was just a little bit too late to the game, because the Saturn's main competitors were the N64 and the brand new Sony PlayStation 1. And the Saturn did kind of get there earlier. I feel like it might have been rushed out, but the issue with it was it simply was not as powerful as either console. I mean, the N64 was a powerhouse at the time. Obviously, it ran on cartridge, so it had the disadvantage of not having access to the kind of CD storage that the Saturn and the PlayStation had. But that 64-bit processing power, you can feel it, right? Like, it is observable, the advantage the N64 had over even the PlayStation, but especially the Saturn. And it's another example of Sega just fucking up their strategy when it comes to developing consoles. But you know what? I actually quite enjoyed my time with the Sega Saturn, because there were some incredible titles for this console. It was definitely better than the Mega CD and the 32X combined, in my opinion. But one of the big drawbacks was that there was no official Sonic the Hedgehog game released for the Sega Saturn, which is a baffling decision. But I guess that transition from 2D to 3D was quite a daunting task for Sonic Team, and they simply didn't have the opportunity to release a fully developed Sonic game for the Saturn, and they just chose to skip it. But what they did release was this compilation of different Sonic games called Sonic Jam. And this game was quite interesting because you picked which game you wanted to play in this 3D overworld, which is the closest thing that we got to a fully 3D Sonic game on the Saturn. And I know for a fact that they were developing an actual standalone 3D Sonic game for the Saturn, but they simply could not get it to work properly. So the best we got was this weird overworld that was part of a Sonic the Hedgehog Best Of compilation. And I remember as a kid, I played the shit out of this overworld. I mean, there were very, very light elements of gameplay. Like you could collect rings, you could kind of explore, but I was obsessed with the overworld from Sonic Jam. It was mind-blowing to me to experience Sonic the Hedgehog in that three-dimensional world. It was just the greatest thing ever. But aside from this example of Sonic autism, I enjoyed a lot of other titles from the Sega Saturn library, and there were some really, really good exclusives for this console. It was actually quite amazing. And I feel very, very lucky that I actually owned one of these things back in the day, because I got to play games like Sonic Team's completely obscure gem in their history, which is a game called Nights into Dreams. Just very, very cool game. You can tell how much passion went into this project. It's like a psychedelic side-scroller with... It is 3D. I wouldn't say fully 3D, but it takes advantage of the 3D generation, right? And it looks incredible. Like the level of creativity is off the charts. And you can imagine they thought that this would be the next big phenomenon. Like this would be Sega's new Sonic the Hedgehog style IP. It would be huge. And perhaps it could have been bigger, but you know what? It was on the Sega Saturn, so I guess hardly anyone played it. But to this day, I don't think Sonic Team has ever gone out quite on a limb like they did with Nights, where they really did push themselves. They tried to create something completely new. Because since then, we've had just various iterations of Sonic the Hedgehog, which have kind of become a meme unto themselves, where the level of quality is decreasing, and the level of creativity is also in decline. So yeah, Nights into Dreams, very interesting game for the Saturn, along with a couple of others that I think are worth mentioning. Definitely the Panzer Dragoon series of 3D rail shooters. I was really into this series in particular, 1 and 2 especially. They're examples of Saturn games that are just totally taking advantage of the platform, beautiful, grungy 3D graphics, and incredible CD-based soundtracks. And Panzer Dragoon 2 is like just the perfection of this, rail shooter gameplay style, because it just is, it's so good. Like there's big incentives to play better, where the higher your score is, the quicker your dragon will evolve and stuff like that. It's just so cool. It's not just a rail shooter. The atmosphere and art direction of these games kind of elevates it to something just sublime. And interestingly, the third game released for the Saturn was actually an RPG. It was called Panzer Dragoon Saga. This game was released at the very end of the Saturn's run, and there's a very small amount of physical copies that were ever produced. So it is a very rare game, and I've personally never played it. I'd like to emulate it someday and actually experience it, but it completely eschews the rail shooter style of the first two games in favor of an actual JRPG. It's a 3D Saturn JRPG. And from what I've read, it's considered a really, really good game. So yeah, and the Panzer Dragoon IP, I think one of the sad things is that it could never really make a transition into the modern era of games. And there was one attempt at reviving it, which was on the original Xbox with Panzer Dragoon Orta, which was a direct successor to the rail shooter style of Panzer Dragoon. And I thought that Orta was really good. I really enjoyed it. Very short, but the graphics were just really solid for the time. It had that original Xbox, just fuzzy, anti-aliased niceness to it. But anyway, the next console in Sega's ill-advised 90s adventures in terms of technology was the Sega Dreamcast. And this is the moment that I parted with Sega as a big fan, die-hard fan, loyal consumer. For me, after the Saturn era, third time's the charm. I've been burned quite a few times. And the thing that swayed me from purchasing a Dreamcast was the library of Sony PS1 games, specifically Final Fantasy VII. And that is the game that caused me to kind of relinquish my loyalty to Sega in totality, because my neighbor had a copy of FF7. I'd experienced that high-quality FMV intro, the music, everything, the huge focus on narrative and world building and these complex JRPG systems. My mind was blown. Truly, I played a little Phantasy Star before this for the Mega Drive, but for me, for my 10-year-old brain, it was time to move on. And Sega, they had a lot of chances with me to retain my, die-hard brand loyalty that only a 90s kid really can understand, I think. But yeah, I think it was a combination of the lack of a true Sonic game on the Saturn combined with the game-changing release of FF7, which to this day is probably my favorite game of all time. And that is the thing, really. That cemented the Sony PlayStation 1 as the killer console, because FF7 was just one of many legendary games for that console. It could be the greatest console ever released, as far as I'm concerned, when you had titles like Resident Evil 2 and Metal Gear Solid 1. But looking back now, I do regret missing the Dreamcast, because check this out, I missed Sonic Adventure. Now, 11-year-old me would have probably had a fucking stroke over how awesome Sonic Adventure was, and I did see footage of it at arcades and stuff like that, at video game stores, and I thought, holy fucking shit, does the Dreamcast look good. But hey, this was the late 90s, and I could not afford more than one console at a time. My family didn't have a lot of money, But what eased the pain for me was the discovery of the JRPG genre, and Final Fantasy really was the next series that I got into heavily. And FF is another extremely, the FF community and fan base is very, very intense. And for me, that was my time to come in. It was after the release of 7, and I must have been 10, 11 years old, so I got into it heavily. And it turned out that the Dreamcast was actually the last console that Sega would actually go all in with. And since then, they've been primarily a publisher, while Sonic Team has continued to produce 3D Sonic games. It's almost like every single one is somehow worse than the next. I think, if you talk to the hardcore fans of the newer Sonic games, they'll highlight a couple that are standouts. I think that Sonic Adventure 2 Battle is considered quite good. Sonic Colors, I think, is looked upon with some degree of fondness these days, but I haven't played that one. And, the only Sonic game in recent history that's actually piqued my interest enough to go and play is Sonic Mania. That game is for me, and that's why I loved it so much, because the devs of Sonic Mania grew up experiencing this exact same saga that I did with Sega, The anticipation, the disappointment, they went through the same thing. It's the millennial experience with Sonic. And what do? Well, the Taxman, right? He produced a Sonic game at the same level of quality that, the classic era Sonic games attained, including the best, which is Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Sonic Mania is the true successor to Sonic and Knuckles. And that must drive Sonic Team mad, really. They're a bunch of Gaijin Spurg developers created a Sonic game that is at least as good, if not better, than the best 2D Sonic game. And even the soundtrack, right? This guy T-Lopes, he creates a soundtrack that not only nails the 90s aesthetic of Sonic the Hedgehog, but he's including references to Sonic CD, remixing classic tracks from the Mega Drive era, but also creating new music that fits perfectly with the best Sonic music that's ever been produced, right? Which includes contributions by Michael Jackson, uncredited, right? Like, unbelievable. Like, Sonic Mania should never have even happened, and yet somehow it got made and turned out to actually live up to expectations. Far exceeding expectations, in fact, and for a 90s Sega kid like myself, it really was something special. In fact, it felt like closure. Like, finally playing a appropriate sequel to Sonic & Knuckles, which came out over 25 years ago. That was really quite a surreal experience. And anyway, I just think right now, with the world in such a chaotic state and with the video game industry in such dire decline, I find myself longing to return to those halcyon days when the only culture war we had to worry about was the irreconcilable schism between kids loyal to Nintendo and the true and honest Sega Justice Warriors.